Apple's planning to announce an exciting new hardware feature at WWDC in a week and a half or so. What it means and why now? Stick around. Hey everyone, welcome back to Today in Tech. I'm Juliet Beauchamp. I'm here with Macworld's Michael Simon, as well as Computerworld Executive Editor Ken Mingis. So you guys, I'm sure, you're the Apple fanatics, you're the Apple pros. Tell me a little bit about these new...
Ken's the fanatic.
I'm the fanatic, but Michael's the pro.
I'm an unbiased journalist. I can't speak for him.
Exactly. Between both of us, you can probably get the story. Juliet, you must be talking about the announcement, or the expectation is going to be ARM processors in upcoming Macs, and what's going on with that, right?
Yes. So what is it? What is an ARM processor? Ken, take it away.
Well, I have to get my joke out of the way first. Obviously, this means that future Macs will be armed and potentially dangerous. We could talk about this at length. You know, Apple has been looking to sort of move away from Intel for a while, or it seems like it has. Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, and I might be. But and one clear way to do that would be for Apple to have its own processors in its hardware. And so the idea here is that coming up at WWDC, we're going to go beyond the usual iOS, macOS announcements. I'm sure there'll be a lot about that. And then Apple's going to talk about a move, which would be a pretty big shift, especially for developers, from Intel to ARM processors in its hardware. Did I get that right, Michael, more or less?
Yeah, I mean, that's the Reader's Digest version of what has been rumored to happen. And this is
I'm all about Reader's Digest.
This has been rumored for a long time. Apple has, so this will be Apple's third major chip transition. It started back in the 90s with PowerPC, which went from Motorola 68000 processors, which was in the very early Macintoshes, had Motorola 68000 chips, they were called. They kind of stopped being good in early, maybe 91-ish, and Apple moved to what was called PowerPC. At the time, there was a big risk, which is a play on words if anybody knows.
I got very good, Michael. Yeah, so I'm not the only jokester today. Carry on.
And the reason why it was so risky is because Intel was the main chip maker. At the time, they had their Pentium chips, and they were in Windows, and they were all over the place, and they were huge, and Apple went in a different direction. And they thought PowerPC would deliver a better roadmap for what they wanted to do with the Mac. And they did for a while, until mid-2000, about 10 years later. About 10 years later.
And about 2005.
And at the time, and so at that time, we were up to the Power Mac G5, and from G3, G4, now with G5, and the gains there weren't great over the previous model, which was the G4. And even the G3, which was in their lower end, like the iMac and the iBook had G3s. And the gains weren't great. So where Apple was able to compete with Intel in the late 90s, in the mid to late 90s, by the mid-2000s, they were not. And Steve Jobs at the time transitioned the entire team, the entire product lineup to Intel processors. And it was a big, big deal. And he famously said at the time that Intel allows us to make the computers we want to make for the next 10 years.
Well, quick reminder, for people who may not be as old as you are, Michael, this was during the processor wars, where there was a lot of, fanboy back and forth. My computer's faster, I've got the Intel whatever. My computer's really faster, I've got the PowerPC. And those, especially on the PowerPC side, those, as you say, those gains were getting more and more incremental. And,
at the time, they would literally have what they call bake-offs on stage. Yeah. Like Steve Jobs would take a high-end Windows PC and pit it up against whatever the latest Mac that he was unveiling, and talk about Pentium versus the G chips. And it was a major thing. You're right. But that's all we had at the time. There was no iPad. There was no iPhone. There was no iPod. It was computers. So everyone was laser focused on computers and speed and all that other stuff. Now, as Apple plans its third, and I would assume last transition, because they're not going to transition away from their own processors.
Correct.
Macs aren't at all what they were. PCs aren't at all what they were. The speeds that they deliver, they're obviously faster than they were 10 years ago. They're faster than they were 2 years ago, but that's not as important anymore. However, Intel has hit a massive roadblock, particularly when it comes to what Apple wants to do with the Mac. Just to get super technical, Intel chips are still fabricated on a 14 nanometer die, which means that's the size of the chip. The smaller it gets, the more power efficient it is, the more speed per core, and all these things that high-end people care about. The iPhone has a 7 nanometer chip and will have a 5 nanometer chip in the fall. Now, that is a massive difference. I'm not saying you can take an iPhone chip, plug it into a MacBook, and have it run fast. However, Apple's gains and Apple's development, Apple's engineering on the chip side has long been better than what Intel is doing for the PCs. And from what we read and from what we hear and from what these rumors are saying, it's now comfortable. It's reached a point where it can say, okay, we can take what we've learned with the iPhone and iOS and the iPad and bring it to the Mac.
Yeah, what's interesting too to think about is the transition here, because I think that's why this is something that would come up at WWDC. If you remember, the move from PowerPC to Intel took a year to 18 months.
About a year.
And a lot of that's because software had to be recoded. Everything had to be redone to work with the new chip. Isn't that when Rosetta was
Yes.
part of the whole? Yeah, that was sort of the bridge. And so I think the speculation, and I think it's valid, is that you're looking at something along those lines. You're going to need some sort of transition so that apps that are built for, running on hardware that's Intel based will be able to work, in the 6 month to 1 year time frame on ARM based Macs.
Yeah, and it might take a lot longer than 6 months to 12 months. And listen, I'm not a developer, I'm not an engineer, but Apple has on macOS right now something called Catalyst. And what that does is allows iPad and iPhone apps to run on the Mac technically. So developers can take their iPhone app, do some minor recoding, not a complete rewrite, and get those apps to run on the Mac. The apps that are on the Mac are not great, but they work. Now, with Apple processors, that whole process might be just a little bit more friendly. And, there are apps that exist, Photoshop, for example, like they are there on the iPad. And perhaps it won't be as difficult as a transition as it was from PowerPC to Intel, as it will be from Intel to whatever Apple calls, these new processors. The other thing to think about is the Mac isn't what it was. In 2005, there was no iPhone. So the Mac was it. But when everyone had a change, these developers had to get on board, or else they were going to leave. They were going to go to Windows because they needed the Mac was the center and the only thing that we worked on. That's not the case.
What are some of these? What does Apple have in store? What are its plans for the Mac that this chip is just going to be so much better suited for than the Intel chips?
Michael, go for that. I wanted to. I was going to ask the same thing.
The number one thing is speed. Intel, every new Mac that comes out, MacBook or iMac or whatever it is, the speed gains are incremental. You can look at the speed charts that we have on Macworld, comparing the MacBook that just came out to the one from last year, the one from the year before. They're faster, but not much faster. iPhone, on the other hand, the speeds are insane. And you can compare that to the best of Android. And you can compare it against a Mac using benchmarking tests, obviously, where it's a bit of an apples to orange type of thing. But if you compare just the base processing capabilities, the iPhone chips are insanely fast. Now, aside from that, Apple obviously wants to make things that are different and better and thinner and more power efficient. And Intel's chips don't really allow them to do that. A smaller die process, again, that 14 nanometer thing down to 5 or 7 nanometers, will allow them to make laptops that last hours longer. Right now, we haven't had 5 hours, 7 hours, 3 hours, whatever the battery life is of your MacBook. It's been the same for 4 to 5 years. It hasn't really gotten all that much better. And then there's the design thing. Apple is constrained by heat, by size, by logic boards and things like that. And if it controls the whole thing, you can see it in the iPhone. Look at the iPhone versus the Galaxy S20. It's inherently better designed because Apple controls the whole process. Samsung buys its chip from Qualcomm, so it's constrained a bit with what it can do because of whatever Qualcomm gives them, they have to work around that. Apple can design the chip to fit the device and the device to fit the chip, and henceforth really do things that it's really hamstrung right now to do with the Mac. Inevitably, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Apple has long wanted to be in control of its entire supply chain. It hates having to rely on Intel or any other supplier for a key component because, as you say, it keeps it from advancing in the way that it wants to go.
And also, Apple's a very small part of Intel, so Intel isn't focused on Apple at all.
Right, which is part of the problem. I wonder if one of the reasons, in addition to, of course, speed and efficiency, which makes a great deal of sense, if one of the things that Apple is also eyeing is the ability to, to sort of evolve some of the subsystems that work with these chips, things like AI and ML or AR and VR. I mean, those are things that if you're relying on Intel chips, and Apple has certain plans, I don't know what they are, but obviously it wants to go in those directions. I think, that maybe Intel is stopping Apple from doing what it wants. You think that's part of the equation too?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the iPhone chip, and it has a neural processor in there. It has different co-processors that work with the chip. The Mac does too. There's the Secure Enclave. There's a T1 chip, but Apple is still limited with how much it can do with Intel's chip. Intel doesn't have any AI stuff at all in the Mac. So yeah, absolutely. And I also think we'll see more of a marriage between iOS and the Mac. I mean, it's there already on the software side, but by controlling the chip, by controlling the entire internals of that machine, they'll be able to advance that even more than we see now.
So obviously you guys said that this is going to be like a 6 to 12 months at minimum rollout. What are some of the what's the newest Mac that's going to have this chip? And is that something that's going to be announced also at WWDC?
I mean, I would guess not. There are rumors that there's going to be new hardware, possibly a new iMac. If that's the case, that'll still be running on Intel. They can't possibly throw a new machine out there without letting developers get their hands on it for a significant amount of time, because it's going to be a nightmare for everybody. So yeah, whatever's announced at WWDC hardware-wise, if anything, will be Intel. The way it worked last time, and that's all we really have to go on, is they announced it in June, the Intel Switch. They gave developers a kit, which was basically a Power Mac G5 at the time that had an Intel processor in it, along with an Intel version of OS X on it, the latest version of OS X that was running on Intel, on the x86 Intel Core. And they gave them time to develop all their apps and to get everything to work. The first Macs didn't arrive until the following January at Macworld, which was an iMac and a MacBook Pro 15-inch, which at the time were the two biggest machines, they're the most popular machines. I don't know how it works now. Right now, I don't even know what the most popular Mac is, because they only sell, 4 million a quarter, which is a lot. But,
well, if you want to be flippant about it, it's probably the iPhone, which of course is not a Mac.
Yeah, right. That's what I was going to say. They sell 40 million iPhones. Yeah,
that's the popular device. But I think you're right. Johnny Evans wrote about this for Computerworld this week, about how do you basically bring the developers along. And I think at one point back when the PowerPC to Intel switch was going on, there was, like, as you say, the hardware kit. I think later on they offered maybe some rebates or price cuts for the developers if they wanted to buy the new hardware.
Because that thing was $1,000 they charged developers to get that machine, and then down the line they could trade that in for a newer Mac or the production models. Yeah.
Do you think that the fact that something like Catalyst is available might make things easier for developers on both sides?
I hesitate to say easier, because I don't want to undermine the work that these developers will need to do, but I think it might be smoother, in the sense that, Apple is going to appeal to iOS developers to iPad developers, to iPhone developers, and say, hey, look, this is another avenue for a revenue audience, and just to develop your product and to get it into a more robust ecosystem. But ultimately, if Apple loses some developers, like somebody like Adobe aside, but I think there's a lot of developers that Apple just doesn't really care about on the Mac right now. I mean, I think they care about their iOS developers, and the Mac is a nice kind of subsection of that. But they're going to think this. I think that this push is going to be, hey, iPad developers, you want to get on a Mac now too.
Yeah, it's unlikely you're going to want to see a lot of Mac developers looking to get on iOS if they haven't already. I don't know that there's many that are sort of desktop or laptop only. I wonder too if this is something that could help Apple with its profit margins. If they're bringing this development in-house, and they can sort of either pad the margins or maybe undercut the competition in terms of the hardware that they're developing.
Sure. Yeah, maybe. I mean, Apple likes its 38% profit margin. It's been,
don't we all?
Had that. If you can look back going 10 years, and it is like a laser between 36 and 39. I mean, it's always there. But what it could do is allow them to add more storage or add bigger screens, or if you're saving costs here, you can engineer more here and still offer a $1,300 MacBook Pro. So we'll see what that brings. I think it's more of an issue for Intel, even though Apple is a small part of their bottom line. Apple is a very visible,
you got the halo factor. I mean,
customer.
Intel loses Apple is a big deal.
I think so too, and I think that whether it might not affect their monthly, their initial quarterly earnings, but I think over time the cachet matters.
Yeah. So here's my question, and this is probably the last question I have until we find out more from WWDC. But all right, so my new 16-inch MacBook Pro, obsolete in 6 months or a year, or
no?
Now,
last time, so again, judging just based on the Intel, they didn't stop supporting PowerPC in OS 10 until
3 years, 4 years.
No, it was 5. It was 2011.
Okay.
Was the last version that supported. It was Lion, I think, Mac OS 10 Lion. I might be wrong about that, but it was many years. It was long past the shelf life of what you would be happy with for a MacBook. So you're not going to not be able to get Mac OS 10.16, 17, 18, 19. Don't worry about that. And I wouldn't discourage anyone from buying a Mac now. I might encourage it, to be honest. Why? Because there are bumps. There's bumps along the road. This might not go as smoothly. Those first ARM Macs might not work as well as you want them to work. They might not have the app support that you want. Whatever emulation environment Apple is going to develop to run Intel apps, it will crash. It will have issues. It's not going to be as smooth as the systems are right now. And right now there's issues because you got 32-bit app and 64-bit apps. It's like, these things aren't easy. So unless you want to be on the cutting edge and you don't really necessarily need your computer to work rock solid for work, I would not buy one of those first Apple-based laptops.
Yeah.
Or
I will not. I do agree with you. There is a price to be paid for the cutting edge.
Yeah.
It's really cool. And in the old days, every new chip, I was always excited about getting the new MacBook or MacBook Pro or whatever just to try it out. But at this point, I'm happy to hang back for 2 or 3 years and wait and see how it all shakes out.
Yeah, I mean, I hope it doesn't. I hope it's not 2 years. I hope it's like a year, or maybe I hope they figure it out quickly. But yeah, it's funny because the Mac may be a small part of Apple's big giant pie chart, but it's an important part for the people who use it. Like, people aren't buying Macs as much for casual use. They're buying it for what they need. So Apple has to kind of get this right and get it right quickly, or else they're going to lose the small audience that they have. Is going to go away because they're going to have to, because things aren't working right. So it's a trickier transition in some ways, and it's an easier transition in other ways.
Don't you assume Apple has had ARM-based Macs running for 3, 4, 5 years? I mean, this has been rumored for a long, long time.
Yeah, that's what. When they announced Intel, Steve Jobs got on that stage and said, "Hey, we've had an Intel x86 version of OS 10 for the last 4 generations. You just never saw it." Yeah, they have to, but just because OS 10 works doesn't mean the apps will work. You know,
Right. But hopefully,
so
I would
there's
assume that this is not just something they're pulling out of the hat.
macOS,
They've been
whatever
working
it
on
is.
this for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's a lot of moving parts here, and they have to,
It's going to be
you
interesting.
know, they're going to have to make some decisions about what to cut and what to keep. And they're going to have to they might just say, you know what, there is no emulation environment. This is it now. We're doing this. And if you can handle it, buy it. If not, stick with your current. I don't know how they're going to handle it, but it's going to be a tricky transition. It's a good transition. And ultimately, I think will pay huge dividends for not just the Mac, but whatever that mythical future device is that does everything we want it to do.
You and the mythical device. It's getting closer.
It does exist.
It's getting closer, Michael. The pieces are falling into place, Yeah.
All right.
Cool. All right. I guess we'll know in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. I think this is more exciting than getting a new iPad. I mean, I'm very anxious to see how they spin this, what the reaction is in the developer community, and what those first Macs look like, and how fast they are.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for calling in, and we'll definitely have more about Apple's official announcement. I have to imagine we'll probably chat about it after WWDC. I cannot say
there'll be
W.
nothing to talk about then.
Just go WWDC, Juliet. WWDC. It's easier.
I like that better. But next week, for sure, be sure to come back, and we'll be doing a WWDC preview of sorts. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Ken, so much for calling in, and thank you for your jokes. I'm glad that we can't see me on camera at all times, so you didn't have to see me shaking my head.
All right. Settle down. I haven't missed my second calling.
All right, and thank you all so much for watching this episode of Today in Tech. If you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell notification in the corner so you're notified every single time we post a new video. If you have any questions, comments about the new ARM chips, leave them in the comments below. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.